For most of his life, George Miller believed his heart belonged to just one woman. And for over 5 decades, that belief never wavered. George was born and raised in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and life moved at a gentle, familiar pace. He met his wife, Helen, when they were both just 19, and from that very first meeting, George knew she was his forever. They married young, built a home together, and spent decades side by side, raising children, building dreams, and weathering life's storms with quiet, unshakable devotion. Their love wasn't flashy or full of grand gestures. It was built on small, steady moments, slow dances in the kitchen, whispered conversations late at night, and holding hands during Sunday church service. George often said, "Helen is my compass, my calm, my home." And for years, that's exactly what she was. But when Helen was in her early 60s, their peaceful world was rocked by a devastating diagnosis: early-onset Parkinson's disease. At first, it was just small tremors and moments of forgetfulness. But as the years went on, her condition worsened. Tasks that once came easily, buttoning a shirt, pouring a cup of tea, became monumental challenges. George, without hesitation, became her full-time caregiver. Day after day, year after year, George devoted himself completely to Helen's care. He learned how to manage her medications, gently helped her dress, and sat beside her through countless doctor's appointments. There were sleepless nights, moments of deep frustration, and heartbreaks too big to name. But through it all, George's love never faltered. Friends and neighbors often marveled at his patience and unwavering commitment, calling it a love story for the ages. For over 20 years, George's life revolved around Helen's needs. And when she finally passed away at the age of 79, George found himself standing in a quiet house that felt impossibly empty. The woman who had been his world was gone, and with her went the life he had known. He was 80 years old, alone, and convinced that his heart had no room left for anything but memories. But life, unexpected, beautiful life, had other plans. How did a man who gave his entire heart to one love find the courage to open it again at 80? What happens when grief slowly makes way for hope, and when an old heart learns to beat with new joy? If you're still here, feel free to subscribe, because George's remarkable journey of love, loss, and rediscovery is about to unfold, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. For George, the role of caregiver wasn't something he had ever imagined when he first fell in love with Helen. But when her diagnosis came, there was never a question in his mind. He would be by her side, no matter what. In the early years, the changes were subtle. Helen's hands began to shake when she tried to sew, something she had loved doing for decades. George noticed her frustration and started helping with the little things, threading needles, folding fabric. At first, it seemed manageable. They adjusted their routines, holding on to their quiet moments of joy. But as the disease progressed, the demands grew heavier. George learned to assist Helen with getting dressed, brushing her hair, and helping her eat when her hands couldn't hold a fork steady. Tasks that once seemed simple now stretched into hours of careful, patient work. He became skilled at reading her expressions, knowing when she was in pain or too tired to speak. Their home, once filled with laughter and music, slowly transformed into a place of quiet determination. Medical equipment filled the corners: pill organizers, walkers, a hospital bed. George kept everything spotless, always ready for the next visit from nurses or therapists. His days were structured around Helen's needs: medication schedules, physical therapy exercises, and gentle reminders of love and presence. Sleep became a luxury. George would often wake in the middle of the night to check on Helen, adjusting her pillows or softly whispering reassurance when she was restless. On the rare occasions when he did sleep through the night, he'd wake up with guilt gnawing at him, worried he might have missed something. Friends and neighbors would offer help, but George was reluctant to accept. "She's my wife," he'd say simply. "It's my job to take care of her." And while his body grew tired and his heart ached with quiet sorrow, his love for Helen only deepened. He found beauty in the smallest things: the way she'd squeeze his hand when she was too weak to speak, the soft smile she gave him when he played her favorite song on their old record player. Their love became something fierce and unbreakable, forged in the fires of hardship. Each day was a testament to their bond, a quiet vow renewed over and over, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. Helen, despite her declining health, never stopped being grateful. "You're my rock, George," she would whisper, her voice frail but full of love. And every time she said it, George felt a deep, aching pride and a sorrow he rarely admitted, even to himself. As the years rolled by, their world grew smaller, but their love never wavered. George sometimes sat alone in the quiet of the evening, watching Helen sleep and thinking back to their youth, to the dances, the road trips, the simple joys they had shared. And though life had taken a hard turn, he never regretted a single moment of their journey together. Little did he know, those years of sacrifice were not just the end of a chapter, but the foundation of a new, unexpected beginning. Helen's passing, though expected after so many years of illness, hit George with a force he wasn't prepared for. No matter how much he had braced himself, no matter how many nights he had whispered quiet goodbyes in his heart, nothing could truly soften the blow of that final farewell. She slipped away on a cool spring morning, her hand resting gently in his. George sat by her side, whispering words of love and comfort until her breathing slowed, softened, and finally stopped. For a long time, he didn't move. He simply held her hand, staring at her peaceful face, as if willing her to come back to him one last time. When the nurses came in and gently guided him to stand, George felt numb. The house, once filled with the steady rhythm of caregiving, now seemed frozen in time. The medical equipment, the stacks of medications, the carefully folded blankets, all reminders of a battle that was now over. The funeral was small, intimate. Family and close friends gathered around George, offering hugs, words of sympathy, and quiet prayers. George stood strong through it all, his face composed, his voice steady. But inside, he felt hollow. His identity had been so intertwined with caring for Helen that without her, he felt like a man unmoored, drifting in unfamiliar waters. In the weeks that followed, George wandered his house in a daze. He found himself still waking in the night to check on Helen, only to remember with a crushing weight that she was no longer there. He'd reach for 2 cups when making coffee, pause at the sound of the phone, expecting it to be a doctor's office, old habits that broke his heart every time. The silence was the hardest part. The house, once filled with Helen's soft voice and quiet presence, now echoed with emptiness. Even the creaks of the floorboards seemed louder, as if mourning her absence alongside him. His days became long and shapeless. He'd sit by the window for hours, staring at the world outside but feeling no part of it. Friends called, neighbors stopped by, but George rarely answered the door. He wasn't ready to face anyone, not yet. Nights were the loneliest. He'd lie awake, clutching the pillow where Helen's head once rested, whispering her name into the darkness. "I miss you, Helen," he'd say. "I don't know how to do this without you." Grief, he realized, wasn't something you moved through quickly. It settled deep into his bones, wrapping around his heart like ivy. Some days, it felt suffocating. Other days, it was a dull, quiet ache that sat with him like an old, unwelcome friend. And though the world around him kept moving, seasons changing, birds returning to nest, neighbors planting new flowers, George felt frozen in time, stuck between the life he had known and a future he couldn't yet imagine. What he didn't know was that this season of sorrow, as endless as it seemed, was quietly making space for something new, a chapter he never expected, but one that would breathe life back into his tired heart. In the months that followed Helen's passing, George's days settled into a quiet, almost ghostly rhythm. The routines that had once given his life structure, medication schedules, doctor appointments, meal times, were gone, leaving long stretches of empty hours that seemed to stretch forever. He would wake each morning to silence. No soft voice calling his name, no list of tasks waiting for his attention. Just the slow creak of the old house and the distant hum of life moving on outside his window. George found himself moving through the house as if in a dream, touching the objects Helen had loved, her knitting basket, her favorite mug, the well-worn chair by the fireplace. Each touch brought a fresh wave of grief, a reminder of how deeply she had filled his world. Without Helen, the house felt too big. The bed seemed impossibly wide. Meals were tasteless and mechanical. George took to eating simple things, toast, canned soup, more out of necessity than hunger. The joy of cooking, of sharing meals, had left with her. Friends and neighbors, ever kind and concerned, continued to check in. They brought casseroles, sat for quiet visits, and offered gentle encouragement to join community events. But George politely declined, again and again. He wasn't ready. He couldn't imagine stepping into a room full of people, smiling and making conversation, when his heart still felt so raw. The loneliness was sharpest in the evenings. After dinner, he'd sit in the living room, the television flickering in the background, but his mind miles away. Sometimes he'd catch himself speaking aloud to Helen, as if she were still there beside him. "Remember that summer we drove to the coast?" He'd say softly. Or, "Helen, you'd laugh at how much dust these old shelves collect." Nights brought a different kind of heaviness. The bed, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt cold and cavernous. George would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the quiet ticking of the clock marking time that seemed to stretch endlessly. More than once, he wondered what his purpose was now. He had spent so many years giving all of himself to Helen's care. What was left for him? At 80, was his story finished? Or was there, impossibly, something still waiting for him? Those were hard questions, ones that lingered in his heart like unanswered prayers. But even in his darkest moments, a tiny flicker of hope refused to be extinguished. Some mornings, as the sun rose and bathed his living room in golden light, George would feel a strange sense of possibility, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, his heart wasn't done yet. He didn't know it then, but life had a way of surprising even the most broken-hearted. In George's story, well, it was far from over. It was a chilly autumn morning when George decided, almost on a whim, to step outside and visit the local park. He hadn't been there in years, his days had been too full of caregiving, his world too small. But something about the crisp air and the way the golden leaves fluttered down from the trees stirred something inside him, a quiet nudge to do something different, even if just for a little while. He put on his coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and made the slow walk down the familiar streets. The park was quiet, save for a few joggers and mothers pushing strollers. George found a bench near the pond and sat down, closing his eyes as the wind whispered through the trees. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of peace. That small outing became the first of many tiny steps. His daughter, Emily, noticed the change and gently encouraged him to get out more. "Dad, why don't you come to the community center's coffee morning?" she suggested one day. At first, George waved her off. But her persistence, paired with his growing restlessness, finally won out. The following week, George walked into the bright, bustling room of the community center, his heart thudding with nerves. There were tables of people chatting, sipping coffee, and playing cards. At first, he felt like an outsider, unsure where to sit or how to start a conversation. But an older gentleman named Frank spotted him lingering by the door and waved him over. "New here?" Frank asked with a grin. "Come join us." Slowly, week by week, George began to find his footing again. He started attending the weekly gatherings, joining in on card games, and even signing up for a painting class, a hobby he hadn't touched since his youth. Holding a paintbrush again felt strange at first, but soon the familiar strokes brought a quiet satisfaction. At home, he began to rediscover small pleasures, tending the garden Helen had once loved, playing old vinyl records on their vintage RCA player, even baking simple bread from scratch. The house still echoed with her absence, but bit by bit, it also began to hum with the presence of something new, George's own quiet resilience. Neighbors started to notice the change. "It's good to see you out and about again, George," Mrs. Peterson said one afternoon as they crossed paths at the market. George smiled politely, a warmth growing in his chest at the words. He hadn't realized just how deeply he had retreated into himself until now. Though the pain of losing Helen never fully left him, George was learning that life had room for more than just sorrow. The days still felt long sometimes, but they were no longer hollow. With each small step, he was reclaiming pieces of himself that had been buried for years. And as winter gave way to spring, something else began to bloom quietly within him, a a readiness he couldn't yet name, but one that would soon open the door to a new and unexpected chapter. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, one of those days George almost stayed home, but something nudged him out the door. He made his way to the community center for the usual coffee morning, expecting nothing more than a few quiet games of cards and small talk. But life, as he was learning, often surprises us when we least expect it. She walked in just as George was settling into his usual seat. Her name was Evelyn, and though George wouldn't have known it then, she was about to change everything. Evelyn had a quiet grace about her, soft gray hair pulled back neatly, kind eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the dim light of the center. She was new to town, having recently moved to be closer to her grandchildren, and a neighbor had suggested she join the morning gatherings to meet people. George noticed her right away. Something about her reminded him of Helen, not in looks, but in spirit. There was a warmth to her, a gentleness that felt familiar and comforting. He watched as she politely introduced herself to the group, her smile easy but her eyes carrying a hint of nervousness. As fate would have it, the only empty seat was at George's table. Evelyn sat down, offering a friendly smile. "First day nerves," she said with a soft laugh. George, feeling surprisingly bold, smiled back. "We've all been there. You'll fit right in." They began chatting, cautiously at first, about the weather, the town, the coffee that could definitely use improvement. But soon, their conversation deepened. Evelyn shared that she, too, had lost her spouse several years earlier. Her husband had passed after a long illness, and she had spent years adjusting to life alone. Her honesty, her quiet strength, struck a chord deep within George. For the first time in a long while, George found himself opening up. He told her about Helen, about the years of caregiving, the love and the loss, the emptiness that had followed. Evelyn listened with such tenderness that it caught George off guard. There was no pity in her eyes, only understanding. By the end of the morning, George realized something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection. As they packed up their things, Evelyn smiled and said, "It was really nice talking with you, George. I hope we can chat again next time." George nodded, his heart unexpectedly light. "I'd like that," he replied. Walking home that day, George couldn't help but reflect on how life had a way of weaving new threads into the tapestry of our days, even when we think it's too late for change. He didn't know what this new connection meant yet, whether it was just a fleeting friendship or something more. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of anticipation for what might come next. And deep down, a quiet question began to form. Could there really be room in his heart for something new? In the days and weeks that followed his first conversation with Evelyn, George found himself grappling with feelings he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he knew how to handle. Each time he saw her at the community center, his heart gave a quiet, unmistakable flutter. They would talk over coffee, share small stories, and laugh at simple things, the kind of easy companionship George hadn't realized he'd been missing. But as the warmth between them grew, so did George's inner conflict. Late at night, he'd sit alone in his living room, staring at the flickering shadows on the wall, wrestling with a guilt he couldn't shake. He loved Helen. That much was certain. He had given her his heart, his loyalty, his life. What would she think of him now, feeling a pull towards someone new? Would she understand? Or would she feel betrayed? One evening, after a particularly long chat with Evelyn that had left him smiling all the way home, George found himself standing at Helen's old photograph. It sat on the mantel, framed in oak, her eyes forever bright and familiar. He reached out, brushing his fingertips over the glass. "I don't know what to do, Helen," he whispered. "You are my world. You still are. But I feel something stirring, something I thought was gone. And I don't know if it's right." He confided in his daughter Emily not long after. Over tea, he hesitated, then quietly shared his feelings. "I've been spending time with a woman from the center," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "She's wonderful, but I feel guilty, like I'm doing something wrong." Emily took his hand, her eyes full of compassion. "Dad," she said softly, "Mom loved you with her whole heart. She would want you to be happy. You took care of her so selflessly for so many years. I don't think love is ever wrong. I think Mom would be proud that you're finding joy again." George felt tears welling up. Her words were like a balm, soothing a part of his heart he hadn't even realized was still raw. He also sought quiet counsel from Frank, his old friend at the community center. "It's not about replacing Helen," Frank said gently one afternoon as they played cards. "It's about honoring the love you had by continuing to live. Helen's chapter in your story will always be there. But maybe it's time to start writing a new one." Those words echoed in George's mind for days. He didn't rush anything. He took his time, letting the idea settle like new roots growing slowly but surely into the soil of his heart. And one bright morning, as he and Evelyn sat under the blooming dogwood trees outside the center, George found himself reaching for her hand, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Evelyn smiled, her eyes kind and knowing, as if she, too, understood the delicate dance they were stepping into. In that moment, George realized something profound. Love doesn't have an expiration date. And the heart, no matter how bruised or broken, always has room for more. Once George allowed himself to lean into the possibility of something new, he found his world shifting in small but beautiful ways. His days began to carry a quiet excitement, the kind he hadn't felt in years. Simple things, a phone call, a shared cup of coffee, a walk in the park, were suddenly filled with meaning. George and Evelyn's friendship blossomed gently, like a spring flower testing the warmth of the sun. There was no rush, no pressure. They both understood the weight of the past and the caution that came with hearts that had been through so much. But there was joy, too real, pure joy in discovering each other's stories and dreams. They spent afternoons strolling through the town's farmer's market, picking out fresh produce and laughing over old recipes. Evelyn loved gardening, and soon George found himself kneeling beside her in her small backyard, helping plant bright marigolds and tender herbs. "It's been years since I had dirt under my fingernails," George chuckled one afternoon, and Evelyn smiled, brushing soil from his cheek. "It looks good on you," she teased. Their conversations flowed easily. They talked about everything: their spouses, their children, their favorite books and songs, their regrets and hopes. George was surprised by how comforting it felt to speak openly about Helen with Evelyn. There was no jealousy or discomfort, just mutual respect and understanding. Evelyn often shared memories of her own late husband, and together they honored the loves they had lost while slowly building something new. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, Evelyn invited George to her porch for tea. They sat quietly, sipping from delicate china cups, watching the world settle into dusk. Without thinking too much, George reached over and gently took Evelyn's hand in his. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the fading light, and squeezed his hand back. Neither of them spoke in that moment, but they didn't need to. The silence was full of understanding, of shared hope and cautious optimism. George began to notice changes in himself, too. His step felt lighter, his laughter came more easily, and his once heavy heart began to feel less burdened. He started making plans again, small things like weekend drives to nearby towns, picnics by the lake, and even a trip to the local theater. Friends and neighbors noticed the glow about him. Mrs. Peterson, ever the observant one, smiled knowingly one morning at the market. "It's good to see you smiling again, George," she said. George returned the smile, his eyes crinkling with quiet happiness. "It's good to feel it again," he replied. The seasons turned, and with each passing day, George and Evelyn's bond grew stronger. They weren't trying to replace the past, they were simply honoring it by embracing the beauty of the present. And in George's heart, a truth settled like a warm embrace. Love is not a single chapter, but a story with many pages. And sometimes, the most unexpected chapters bring the deepest joy. As months passed, George found himself living a life he never could have imagined in those dark days after Helen's passing. His days were no longer marked by emptiness, but by moments of quiet joy and deep companionship. With Evelyn by his side, each day felt like a gift, one that he had almost convinced himself he would never experience again. Their relationship blossomed into a steady, comforting presence. They didn't need grand adventures or elaborate plans to feel fulfilled. A simple afternoon at the park, sharing a sandwich and watching children play, brought them both profound happiness. Evenings were spent reading side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing passages that sparked memories or laughter. George's family, especially his daughter Emily, welcomed Evelyn with open arms. "She's wonderful, Dad," Emily said after a family gathering where Evelyn's warmth and kindness had won everyone over. "I can see how happy she makes you." George smiled, a deep, genuine smile. "She's been a blessing," he replied quietly, his heart swelling with gratitude. Their community also embraced the couple. At church, people would smile and nod approvingly when they saw George and Evelyn arrive together, sitting hand in hand in the same pew where George had once sat alone. At the community center, they became known as the pair who radiated quiet joy, often spotted sharing soft conversations over coffee or working on jigsaw puzzles side by side. One particularly bright spring afternoon, George and Evelyn sat beneath a large oak tree, a picnic spread between them. As they sipped lemonade and watched the clouds drift lazily across the sky, George turned to Evelyn and said softly, "I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again. I thought my heart was too full of the past to ever feel something new." Evelyn smiled, her eyes warm. "Our hearts are amazing things," she replied. "They can hold so much more than we ever think possible." George nodded, reflecting on her words. He realized that his love for Helen hadn't been diminished by his new relationship. It had simply expanded. His heart had grown, making space for both the love he had lost and the love he had found. And in that space, he had rediscovered his own capacity for joy, resilience, and hope. He had spent so many years caring for Helen, and after her passing, he had believed that chapter to be his last. But now, at 80, he understood something deeper. Life is a series of chapters, some filled with sorrow, others with unexpected new beginnings. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the field, George leaned back against the tree, Evelyn's hand resting gently in his. He felt content, at peace, and quietly amazed at how life had unfolded. He had found love not once, but twice. And in doing so, he had proven, to himself and to everyone around him, that the heart, no matter its age or its scars, always has room for more. George often found himself sitting by the window in the quiet of the mornings, a warm cup of coffee in hand, watching the world wake up around him. The same town, the same streets, the same old oak tree outside his house, but everything looked different now. Or perhaps he had simply changed. His journey through love, loss, and rediscovery had taught him that life is never finished writing our stories. Just when he thought his best days were behind him, just when he believed his heart had nothing left to give, life had whispered otherwise. George's story is a reminder to all of us that love doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't matter how many birthdays have passed or how many wrinkles we've gathered along the way, our hearts remain beautifully capable of feeling, of connecting, and of finding new reasons to beat. There were times when George doubted himself, when guilt and fear made him question whether opening his heart again was the right thing to do. But standing here now, hand in hand with Evelyn, he knew without a doubt that love is not a betrayal of the past, it's a tribute to it. Every laugh they shared, every quiet moment of companionship, honored the love stories that had come before. And isn't that what life is about? Carrying forward the love we've been given, making space for new joys, and bravely stepping into each new chapter, even when we're not sure where it might lead. George's advice to anyone watching his story would be simple. Don't let age or fear keep you from embracing what your heart longs for. Whether it's love, a new friendship, a passion you've always wanted to pursue, it's never too late. Life is full of unexpected turns, and sometimes, the most beautiful moments come when you least expect them. He would smile, tilt his head thoughtfully, and say, if there's something your heart is whispering to you, listen. Don't wait for the perfect time, because the perfect time is now. So, I want to ask you, what dream or desire have you kept tucked away, thinking it's too late? What new chapter is waiting to be written in your own story? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're a community here, and your journey matters. And if George's incredible story touched your heart today, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Here on this channel, we celebrate the resilience, courage, and unbreakable spirit of those who remind us all that dreams don't fade with age, they evolve. Because it's never too late to dream.